Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'm very glad to take over and to introduce Dr. Virginia Bainbridge. I'm very proud of Virginia. She was my postgraduate student, and I'm very proud of what she's achieved. She's really began life really as an ecclesiastical historian of the medieval period, and worked on Cambridgeshire and the religious fraternities in Cambridgeshire. And she's now very interested in Zion Abbey and the records of that great female monastic house. So, but Virginia has also worked as an editor for the Victoria County History for Wiltshire, and more recently she's worked on the Manorial Documents Register, which I'm sure she will be telling us about, this great record of all the manorial records that survive in England in all the repositories all over England and indeed Wales as well. And Virginia worked on the records, particularly of Wiltshire and of Oxfordshire. So she was very well equipped to take over and finish, helping us to finish looking at the court records or the manorial court records of Hampstead. And she's going to tell us a bit about those records, but about manorial records more generally. So thank you, Virginia, and thank you for helping us, and over to you.
Well, I'm delighted to have been invited to celebrate with you today on the completion of Camden History Society's Hampstead Court Roll project. And I want to tell you that this project is important nationally as well as locally. And this English translation of the Latin court rolls, 1572 to 1733, is part of one of the largest surviving collections of manorial records in Britain. Those records belonging to Westminster Abbey estates. And it is also, of course, a major contribution to the history of large swathes of North London, which once fell within the boundaries of the ancient manor of Hampstead. The project represents a successful partnership, as Malcolm Holmes has just outlined, between private generosity, the expertise of publicly funded archive and library staff, and Camden History Society, the voluntary organisation which has provided the framework for hard-working members to bring this project to completion over 2 decades. So it's been a lot of work for the individuals involved. So we do really need to celebrate today. The court rolls, which survived from 1572 to 1733, reveal Hampstead's change from rural village to London suburb. And of course, you are now able to read typed English translations of them. We will now turn to our second slide, which I hope you can all see. And that is the Hampstead Manor and Estates up to about 1540. And as I've already mentioned, the Manor of Hampstead was one of the great estates held by Westminster Abbey, arguably the most prestigious monastery founded by the Anglo-Saxon kings. It's uncertain as to the date, but certainly rebuilt by Edward the Confessor from about 1042 AD. It was dissolved by Henry VIII in 1539, and in 1540 he granted the estate to the new Diocese of Westminster, which was itself dissolved in 1550. Afterwards, the Crown granted the manor to Sir Thomas Roth, and in 1620 it was sold to Sir Baptist Hicks and descended in his family to 1707, when it was sold to Sir William Langhorne. It then passed through various hands until the manorial rights lapsed in 1944. Westminster Abbey's great manor of Hampstead, which you see here on a map, which is taken from Victoria County History for Middlesex, Volume 9, originally consisted of around 2,000 acres of North London. It stretched from North End in the north, through St John's Wood in the west, to Chalk Farm in the east, and Camden in the south. But in the course of the Middle Ages, around half of the original acreage had been granted to other religious houses or sublet to secular tenants, who then paid the manorial lords rent for their holdings. And you can see the list here. The largest of these estates, now suburbs of London, were Belsize, Chalcott, now known as Chalk Farm, which was granted by Henry VI to Eton College when he founded it in the 1440s, Kilburn Priory, the Temple, which was was originally granted to the Knights Templars, but on their dissolution passed to the St John's Hospitallers, and so hence we get St John's Wood, and then Kingswell and Flitcroft, which were estates that were tenanted by secular sort of sublords. Well, all these documents are held in the Westminster Abbey Library and Muniment Room. So they have nearly all the medieval Latin documents relating to the history of Hampstead Manor. And they include a stray court roll, which I don't think has been translated, for 1295 to 6, manorial accounts, which have patchy survival, but provide different sort of information, which I'll come to later. And they survived for 1272 to 98, 1321 to 2, and 1524 to 39. So the early ones in the late 1200s, from a very interesting time in economic history, and then shading over into the early 1300s, where we have famines and poor harvests and things, which contribute to the negative effect of the Black Death coming along later. So very interesting. And of course 1524 to 39, just on the eve of the dissolution, so you can see how the estates were managed at that time. There's also a rental from 1281 and other rentals from the 13 and 1400s, and an extent for 1312 to 13, which is in Cambridge University Library. So we've got all sorts of other things that we can look at if we want to go earlier than 1572. And so I've mentioned some of these types of documents. And so in this slide, we are looking at different types of manorial records. And manorial documents are a large and diverse category of records. They include court records, which of course we're discussing most closely today, but also the second type of records, business accounts, and surveys of lands and tenants. And these survive for almost 1,000 years of British history. Domesday Book is the first survey of England's manors and estates in 1086, but we have to wait really for another 100 or so years before more records are written. And they survived from the decades around 1200 for most places in England and Wales. The parish took over as the basic unit of local government around 1600, and most people have assumed, I think, that manor courts just shriveled up and disappeared, but many of them continued their work, and surprisingly many made records after 1700, as they did in Hampstead. In 1922, the Law of Property Act abolished the powers of manor courts, and the manorial document register which I've already mentioned and Caroline has mentioned, was set up to protect their tenants. And this was because if you were a tenant of the manor and all the documents disappeared, you would have no record of the fact that you leased your cottage, your small holding, or indeed your business premises from the lord of the manor. So because so many people held their properties by leasehold, in those days, mainly copyhold, it was vital that these records should be preserved. And so I've put on the screen the web address of the National Archives Manorial document register, and you can go to that and you can type in the name of your manor, in our case Hampstead, and the name of your parish, and then you can get a lovely list of all the documents that survive. And what's very useful is that you don't just have to think, well, which archive are they likely to be in? Oh, well, Westminster Abbey Muniment Room or London Metropolitan Archives. They'll actually give you these stray references that have got all over the country, and sometimes even in the USA or other countries where the documents have been taken. So what I'll do is we'll briefly look or talk about the second and third types of manorial records. It says number 1 here, business accounts, number 2, surveys, maps and valuations, but we'll have a quick look at them because they too can provide good information about your manor, about your area or members of your family. So business accounts were made by the reeve or bailiff, a tenant who assessed the crops and livestock raised on the manor. And if we think to Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales, he described a typically shrewd medieval reeve who held a difficult position between the lord and the other tenants. Medieval accounts record details about farming, industry, building work and the weather, which are absent from later accounts, which are really, by the time you get into the 16 and 1700s, they're mainly figures. So not quite as helpful in terms of quirky details about your locality. So the third type of records is surveys. And this is a very large category of manorial records. Surveys and valuations recorded the assets and income of a manor. And the earliest surveys were made by monasteries like Westminster Abbey. They had the institutional resources, the writing skills, the wealth to pay scribes, to produce parchment, to make surveys. And even if the king or the secular nobles and aristocrats were making surveys earlier on, very often with the accidents of families dying out in the male line, accidents of inheritance, these things were lost. So most of the surveys that are the earliest survive from around 1200, like those ones I've already mentioned, which were made for Westminster Abbey. But right through until the 1940s, landlords continued to make surveys of various types. And we've seen that there are some of these documents. We've seen that there is an extent in Cambridge University Library, and that describes the assets of the manor, the fields, pastures, meadows, woods, sometimes gives a description of the manor house and other buildings. And rentals, we've got quite a lot of rentals from before Westminster Abbey was dissolved. And these always provide a list of tenants and their annual rents. And after around 1700, when map making began to develop and was utilised by the owners of great estates, they often come with a map. And so then you will find that there is a number for each tenant or holding, tenement perhaps is the term used, and that number corresponds to where that property is on the map. So once again, these can be very useful, and rentals survive in large quantities for all periods of manorial history. So we will now turn to first category, manor court records. And these are both court rolls and court books. Court proceedings were originally summarised on parchment sheets, rolled and stitched together. They were written by the Lord Steward in abbreviated Latin and in English during the Commonwealth period, 1649 to 53, and again by decree of Parliament after 1733, as at Hampstead. From around 1500, court records were increasingly kept in paper books as opposed to more expensive parchment sheets. And obviously with the book, once the proceedings have been copied up, normally from a rough version that has been made by the scribe, then they're harder to lose, so quite a good thing. So as we see here, manorial court records for Hampstead Manor are all held, apart from that stray from the 1200s, at the London Metropolitan Archives. And they were recorded on rolls, 1572 to 1705. Here we are looking at, here we have the call numbers, 1572 to 1705, and in books, 1706 to 1935. So they had transferred to books quite relatively late in the 18th century. And in addition, the steward of the manor also kept various series of court papers, and these become more voluminous as we get into the period that we're talking about today. And they included draft court proceedings, correspondence and minutes, perambulations of the boundaries of the manor, so those can be a nice thing to look at too. S1s or excuses for not attending court, estreats or fines for various misdemeanours, presentments of tenants for offences against the Lord or public order, and lists of residents. So there are a lot of ancillary documents that relate to our court books, which are also useful and important, and you can find all of those for our period, 16th, 17th, early 18th century at London Metropolitan Archives. So there's two main types of court, and this is something that can get people confused. So I'll talk about the court baron and then the court leet. So the manor court or the court baron was the court of the lord or lady of the manor and was chaired by the steward. Freehold tenants and chief customary tenants, later known as copyholders, had to attend or pay fines. A jury of 12 chief customary tenants verified proceedings. They acted as pledges to ensure tenants obeyed court orders. Now, the main activity of later manorial courts was to do with copyhold. I've already mentioned copyhold leases. And after the parish took over many aspects of local government around 1600, the manor courts which remained active concentrated on enrolling leases of farms and cottages. Tenants were given a copy of the entry in the court roll, which proved that they were the lessee, and these came to be called copyhold leases. So that's where the term comes from. The other type of court, the court leet, sometimes known as the view of frank pledge, was granted the right to hold one of these, was granted by the Crown to some lords, and it was the lowest level of royal jurisdiction. The courts issued, for example, victualling licenses to brewers and bakers and investigated false weights and measures. They appointed manorial officers, including constables and overseers of the highways, even after 1600, when you sort of think that the parish is doing quite a lot of that work, but not in every place. They tried misdemeanours, offences against public order, such as violent fights, and passed serious cases on to 100 and quarter sessions court. So these are the Crown courts. In practice, proceedings of the court baron and court leet overlapped. After around 1600, leet cases were generally held at a special court baron held once or twice a year. And here, as we see in our slide that's on the screen, this is Hampstead Manor Court Book C, and I had the pleasure of translating a chunk of this book, and very interesting it was too. And we have here the start of the court for the 17th of January 1731. That was how they called it then. With the changes to the calendar, we would now say it was 1732. And you can see at the top of this, the court is held by William Langhorne, who was the lord of the manor. And so here we have the date and other things. And I've mentioned this homage. We've got the homage. We've got 3 juries who are there to swear that the proceedings are correct. And then we get into the meat of the court proceedings. Ad hanc curia, to this court, or it is presented, presentatur est, by the homage. And so here we get into one of these property transactions, which are the main business of the court. And so why did courts like Hampstead Manor Court survive? Well, it was one of many manor courts which survived into the 18th century and beyond. In our case, proceedings go right up into the 1940s. And they survived because they provided the residents with an important service which was not available to them. And the thing is that the Lord makes quite a bit of money from courts, and people come along and they transfer their copyhold tenancies to other members of their family, their children or grandchildren, or they sell them for money, and that transaction is registered. So they have to pay for that, but they get the security of having that transaction recorded. And we can see when we look at this page of the Hampstead Manor Court Book C, that the handwriting is a fine professional legal script of the 18th century. Some of the letters are a little hard to read for the modern eye, but you do get into it gradually. So it's been done by a professional. So it is a good and fair copy that is accessible to all. The main business of the court barons was to transfer copyhold, as I've mentioned, leasehold property from one tenant to another, to verify transfers and to protect legal title. The middling sort, and even some of the wealthier people who used the court baron in this way, were not wealthy enough to register their property transactions in the King's courts. So it cut both ways. The lords get something, they get some money for providing this service, and the tenants also get this legal advantage. Well, in the early 18th century, as in Court Book C, the lords of Hampstead Manor held a court baron 4 times a year, where the main business was indeed the transfer of copyhold tenancies. A court leet, or view of frank pledge, as we have learned, the lowest court of royal justice licensed by the Crown, was also held once a year. And following contemporary practice, the view was combined with Hampstead Court Baron, as in May 1732. Its main business then was to appoint the jury for the Vill of Hampstead and constables and chief pledges for Upper and Lower Hampstead, respectively. So what else can we discover from our court records from the early 18th century? Hampstead Court Book C reveals the process of transition of the areas covered by Hampstead Manor from semi-rural hinterland to London suburbs. And this was a long process starting in earlier centuries, and it has been excellently described for the 17th century by Camden History Society's very own Dr. Peter Woodford in his glimpses of 17th century Hampstead as seen from the manorial court rolls. And some of you will know that that was published in the Camden History Review for 2012. And he provides a wealth of information in a few short pages and some additional references of things you can refer to if you get interested. And so from 1620 to 1700, the period that he was concentrating on, the manor was mainly farmland, where many small holding families made a living. And they didn't have much land, but they had the benefit of grazing rights for sheep, goats then known as the poor man's cow, because you could get milk out of them, but they weren't as expensive to buy and to feed, and cattle. And so these could graze on the common pastures of what we now call Hampstead Heath. In the 17th century, Dr. Woodford also notes new industries of brick and tile making were beginning to be established, and they obviously fed the need for building materials in neighbouring London and its growing suburbs. London tradesmen were moving to cottages in the rural villages and hamlets which now make up Camden Borough. And some grand houses were built for the wealthy. Speculative ventures to attract the wealthy out of London included leisure activities like the bowling green and Hampstead Spa, both short-lived. So people had grand ideas, but it didn't always translate into cash. When we turn to the 18th century, we see that this process has progressed. And so there are quite a lot of these very long cases in the 18th century court rolls, often 2 to 3 sides detailing exactly the property which is being transferred, which show that some of these customary tenements, as they were called, had originated as small holdings or cottages. But by this time, they were joined together with other properties, generally small pieces of adjacent land, so just little parcels of land, gardens, and little closes of pasture, and also recently enclosed parcels of the waste of Hampstead Heath. And the combined acreage of these holdings was small, often a large house was built, which indicated that the occupants did not make their livelihoods from agriculture. So we've got, as well as the property transaction, we can see social change occurring as well. And in the court rolls which I translated, there were a number of holdings that were newly enclosed by brick walls. And within the walls were built gentry residences with stables and outhouses. Some also had parcels of meadow, presumably for grazing coach or riding horses. Another thing that's interesting to note is that the social status of the owners and occupiers of these customary holdings had also risen. The new tenants weren't just the tradespeople who had come out of London, perhaps to live in more rural areas, as in the 17th century. They were generally of a higher social status than those people from whom they were taking over, and they included professional people and even aristocracy. A cottage at Cloth Hill had been combined with other properties, once leased by the Right Honourable Lord Paget and afterwards by Anne, Lady Crewe, who was the daughter of Sir William Arminy, 2nd Baron of Osgorby, Lincolnshire, who married 3 times. So she probably went up the pecking order every time she acquired another widow's portion. So there were these quite grand people living in the area. Court Book C also records the development of the Hampstead High Street area, where courtyards, tenements, shops and business premises provided prosperous customary tenants of the manor with rental incomes from subtenants. And so you can see in the court roll that these people who are actually have the tenancy of the property have got subtenants. And other interesting things emerged from this. Changes to the water supply for a courtyard of residential properties behind Hampstead High Street were required in 1731 to 32. And Hampstead Heath was pitted with ponds, which had originated as gravel pits to provide materials for building work. And obviously, if it's common land, you can go and dig up building materials if you have got a tenancy within the manor, and cause all sorts of havoc for other people. So we've got these changes to the amenities and what we might loosely call the infrastructure to accommodate the development of all these new areas and hamlets and the extension of the towns. So those are just a few of the things that I've discovered from my brief foray into the history of Hampstead Manor in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the English economy was characterised by cycles of boom and bust, relating to phases of trade and international warfare with other European powers. In London and its hinterland, building booms reflected prosperity amongst the upper ranks of society based on investments in trade. Slumps were also reflected in slumps in building work. So the suburbanisation of the villages of Hampstead's Manor therefore proceeded by fits and starts. And the suburbs of the area still retain a village feel because of the existence of shops and houses of all different periods of building. And here you see an early 18th century building on Hampstead High Street, set back from some of the other houses, and that's number 45 to 46, which is just one example of an early 18th century survival amongst later buildings on the bustling High Street. So that's just a very brief introduction, really, to what is on the internet, which I hope you're all going to look at for yourselves. And I would like to say that in conclusion, the Camden History Society's Hampstead Court Roll project is a great achievement. It now makes available translations of all the Latin court rolls and books from 1572 to 1733 for the general public. Dr. Peter Woodford's triple index is invaluable to local and family historians. All the court proceedings are indexed by place, person and occupation, telling the story of Camden suburbs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. That was very interesting, and I'm glad that you were able to draw attention to how public-spirited the Camden History Society has been in putting these records and making these records available and translating them. Can I just clarify something? The manorial records pre-dissolution, when the Manor of Hampstead belonged to Westminster Abbey, are in Westminster Abbey Muniment Room. Post-dissolution ones are in the London Metropolitan Archives. Is that right?
That's generally the division. We've got some strays that have been picked up by the Manorial Document Register elsewhere, so you can see them all on one page on the Discovery website, but generally that's the division. And there's a sort of gap where there isn't anything because the documents didn't get passed on. So really our main court rolls survived from 1572, not from 1540.
Right. Oh, I see. They just, yeah.
Yeah, we threw them away.
Yes, yes. Now, if you would like to ask a question, please either, put your hand up using the reactions button at the bottom, or wave your hand, and Malcolm or I or Lindsay will try to spot you. So has anyone got a question that they would like to ask Virginia, or indeed any of the other knowledgeable people who are here tonight? Right. But, oh, yes, Mark Hutchison, ask your question. Can you unmute? Can you unmute, or has Lindsay? There you are. Well done.
No, it's still muted.
No. Oh.
You're still muted, Mark. That's it.
No, it's gone back again.
It's gone back in.
Oh.
Just do a single click. That. Oh. Is Lindsay there? I wonder if Lindsay has muted people. No.
No, he's here.
It's all right now.
Good.
Mark.
I was very interested in Dr. Bainbridge's comment that the manorial rights of Hampstead lapsed in 1944, and I wonder if she could explain how and why that happened.
Well, that's what it says on the London Metropolitan Archives website. So I copied it from them. But I think what they mean is that although the powers of the manorial court were extinguished in 1922, it took quite a lot of years after that for all the copyhold tenancies to be commuted into leasehold tenancies, because obviously you can't hold your copyhold tenancy from a body that has got no power, so they had to be transferred. And then the other thing was that people who had manorial rights, lords of the manor, had to be compensated for the fact that they had lost the income that came from being able to transfer these tenancies. And there's quite a lot of interesting documentation in the National Archives about that process. So by 1944, all of the copyhold tenancies had been extinguished. All of the work of the manorial court had been tied up, and the lord of the manor had been compensated for loss of income.
Right. Thank
Can
you.
I ask a supplementary question then? How and why was it that in 1922 the manorial court was extinguished? Was that part of the general reform of property law in this country that took place between 1922 and 1925?
Yes, it was.
Thank you.
Right. Well done. You answered your own question really there, Mark. Yes. Has anybody else got a question?
I'll ask one.
Malcolm, yes.
Right, it's arising from that, and I should actually say Mark is the chair of the Heath and Hampstead Society, a body for which, you know, these records are prime, and a lot of it arose out of recent inquiries we had about it. Now, Hampstead does actually still have a lord of the manor, who is Viscount Gough. Well, so much has been extinguished. Might there be any powers or anything that he still holds?
No, it's
Nothing.
just an honorary title. I mean, people buy lordships of the manor, don't they? But it doesn't mean anything. It means that you've inherited the title, but nothing else.
Right, because I sometimes wonder, because I know in some areas there's still, the lord of the manor still has rights over people's access across land to their property and things like that, but obviously that doesn't rely here.
No. These are what you might call peculiars. They're bizarre quirks that have survived, but they don't represent the run-of-the-mill situation where all those rights were extinguished.
And is it correct, Virginia, that after 1922, no manorial records can be exported from this country?
That's true. I think it was 1925 when the manorial document register really got itself going, and manorial records are not allowed to be exported now, but some of them had gone already. So you get quite large collections of manorial records in places like the Huntington Library in California, or the Folger Library in, I think it's Chicago, where they got these lovely documents in the past, and they thought, oh, wonderful, you know, here's this wonderful old script and all this information about how they did things back in the manorial days. So those have had to stay where they were.
Yes, because they were sold as part of great estate collections of estate documents. Yeah, certainly the Huntington and the Folger do have some, but they look after them as well. And this is why the manorial documents register is so useful, because it tells you where you can find the records, which are not always where you would expect, as you rightly say. Yes. Has anyone else got a question they wanted to ask Virginia? Peter, yeah, you've been much praised, and your work has been much praised, and quite rightly, I think. Do you have anything you would want to say? If so, you'd have to unmute yourself, unless Lindsay can do it for you.
Yes. Is that all right?
Yes, that's
Yes.
fine. Yes.
It's not a question so much as an observation. I became very interested in the period when Church Row was being built, and the whole business of Hampstead Spa was growing up, and at that point the transactions had become quite different. They weren't going through the lord of the manor anymore. individuals seem to acquire plots of land and built a house on it. I wondered why that had come about, why suddenly the law, as far as I could tell.
I don't know about Peter. You froze at certain points then. So you were asking why people were acquiring plots of land and building on them, and that was different, you thought, from earlier procedures?
Yes, well, they were no longer did they have to purchase anything from the lord of the manor, as far as I can see.
Yes, that to me that's very, very interesting, and all I can do is speculate. But other people might have better ideas. That I wonder if that was part of a rectory estate or a glebe, and so they were purchasing from another owner. But that's my only thought about that. If it's in Church Row, I mean, that's all very close to the church.
That's true. Yes. It was clearly a speculative building of lodging houses, essentially, and making money from the influx of people coming to the spa.
Well, Church Row is a very nice lodging house, I must say, nowadays. Thanks, Peter, and I hope you're pleased.
It does strike me that in the record, the manorial records that I was transcribing, there was no mention of the Lord of the Manor.
Sorry, there was no mention of.
Oh,
That's all.
No.
I don't think I heard that. Did you hear that, Malcolm? Could you hear what Peter?
No, I think we've lost the connection slightly.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Sorry, Peter, we couldn't hear you very well. I just wondered whether, Robert Lingo, you have anything to say, who were the only begetter of this project and kindly put the money up. I hope you're pleased with the result.
Unmute. Peter,
Yeah. I'm unmuted. No, I'm really an observer of this. I was delighted to be approached by Malcolm and others some, goodness knows how many years ago, 20 or 30, 40 years ago maybe, when I was still working. And frankly, in that time, I wasn't really, truthfully, as interested in Hampstead as I am nowadays. But it's wonderful to see such a project having with difficulty taken off to produce this sort of result, and I was able to fund start off of it. I don't know how much the whole thing cost in the end, but it was really done through my firm and my partnership agreement, and all the partners of Arthur Anderson. Sadly, Arthur Anderson is no longer with us. And that partnership agreement actually required all the partners to undertake this sort of voluntary donation work. And I just wonder whether that is something which is visible even to today, and maybe more widely spread than I'm aware of. But I'm delighted that the small amount of money I was able to give has produced this. I'm very pleased.
Well, it obviously shows, I hope, that, you know, donations of this kind can be of benefit to large numbers of people and have a really, I mean, a lot of people can be interested in manorial records if they're translated into English. And all these people are interested in family history. They think of parish records, but here you can actually, manorial records can tell people as much about their families as parish records can. So it's a really important source and something that you've enabled many people to make use of. So I hope you're pleased with it, because we are. Anyway, has anyone else got a question they'd like to ask Virginia? Look, sorry, that was okay. If then nobody else wants to ask Virginia a question, you can always get in touch with her or look at the Manorial Documents Register website and make use of this material now that it's there. Okay, so Malcolm, do you want to say something about future meetings of the Society?
Yes, indeed. Our next meeting of the Society is on the 16th of September, and it's Wartime London in Paintings. And it's a talk by Suzanne Barjett, who is the Head of Research and Academic Partnerships at the Imperial War Museum. And she's got an exhibition currently on at the Churchill War Rooms in Whitehall. And she's also an author of a book on wartime London in paintings. And of course, with the destruction of so many records during the war, these paintings are actually invaluable. And so I really look forward to seeing a lot of pictures that we might not have seen in any other form. And then after that, we have on the 14th of October, a talk on a pioneer psychotherapist in Camden, Dr. Jessie Murray. Again, all the talks are at 7:30. But can I say that if we are still seeking more speakers for talks, either by Zoom or luckily we are actually looking at a real meeting for next year at the moment, because we don't know quite when things will open up, but we are looking at speakers who might be able to speak in person or via Zoom. The other appeal I have to make is I've inherited the role of editor of the Camden History Society newsletter. So many of you may come across interesting illustrations, snippets of information, or an article about something that fascinates you. I certainly would welcome anything to help fill the pages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. And thank you, Virginia, for a very interesting talk. I've learned a lot from it. And one of the things that manorial records show often is you can find out a lot about women's history. Unexpectedly, you can find a lot about women having quite a lot of, what should I say, autonomy, and acting on their own initiative and running businesses and sometimes acting as manorial officials as well. So, you know, they're not just about lords and they're not just about men. And they're a very interesting source. And thank you so much for giving your time to talk to us this evening. It's been really good. And thank you to Peter. Thank you to Robert who funded this. And thank you all for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at the next meeting of the Camden History Society. And incidentally, thank you, Lindsay, for keeping the technical aspects of this evening working well. I see that. So thank you all and see you again soon. Good night.
Yeah, thank you. Good night.